How are ya? Glad to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming out for yet another night of the 2025-2026 Inprint Margaret Root Brown Reading Series. It's our 45th season. And yeah, we're not giving up. And tonight, we're happy and honored to present George Saunders with his best-selling new novel, Vigil. This evening marks George's fourth appearance in the Inprint Brown Reading Series. His first took place 23 years ago across the street at the Alley Theater, where George appeared with another brilliant young author named Colson Whitehead. In 2014, he read the opening story in 10th of December and had an amazing conversation with Matt Johnson. His last visit was in 2017 for Lincoln in the Bardo, when George's choral reading included 5 great Alley actors. Our thanks to tonight's conversationalist, author and Rice professor Lacey Johnson, and to all of you for joining us this evening to celebrate and savor the power of storytelling. My name is Rich Levy. I'm executive director of Inprint, and since 1980, the Inprint Brown Reading Series has presented more than 400 extraordinary writers from 40 countries, including winners of 13 Nobel Prizes, 74 Pulitzer Prizes, 71 National Book Awards, 19 Booker Prizes, as well as 23 U.S. Poets Laureate. We strive to bring you the very best authors in the world in a series accessible to everyone. Thank you for joining us on the journey. Next up, on Monday, March 23rd at the Alley, we present the great Mexican novelist Alvaro Enrique with his new novel, Now I Surrender, which Publishers Weekly in a starred review calls a major work of historical reclamation, an eloquent rejoinder to the mythos that made 2 countries while erasing the lives of their original inhabitants. General admission tickets go on sale tomorrow at noon at inprint.org. We have more great Inprint Reading Series events this spring featuring Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Marie Howe, Life of Pi author Jan Martel, and 2 great Inprint fellows with debut books, Brittany Ray Kroll and Nina McConaughey. Hope you'll join us. We also offer, free of charge, the Inprint Cool Brains series, featuring this Sunday, March 1st, Newbery Medal winner Meg Medina and her new middle grade novel, Graciela in the Abyss. We offer bus scholarships, 100 free copies, signed copies of Meg's book, and a musical performance. It's called Simba and the Lobster. On Monday, March 2nd, we present a special evening with renowned poet, MacArthur Fellow Edward Hirsch, and his new memoir, My Childhood in Pieces, free of charge at Congregation Emmanuel, in conversation with memoirist Leah Lax. Each year, we offer more than 90 community writing workshops across the city for aspiring authors, senior citizens, K-12 teachers, veterans, healthcare providers, the incarcerated, and others to empower folks to tell their stories. Info on all this, plus the Inprint online archive of readings, fellowships, and prizes for emerging authors, and more, is on our website, inprint.org, where you can join the email list and follow us on social media if you want to. Inprint receives invaluable support from the Brown Foundation. This series is named for one of its founders, the Jerry C. Deering Family Foundation, Houston Endowment, the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance, and the Texas Commission on the Arts. Special thanks to Wynn Park. Now, after George reads from and talks about Vigil, he'll join in conversation right here with Lacey M. Johnson, professor, curator, and activist. She is author of the essay collection, The Reckonings, and the memoir, The Other Side, both National Book Critics Circle Award finalists, and another memoir, Trespasses. She is editor with designer Cheryl Beckett of More City Than Water, a Houston Flood Atlas. Lacey teaches creative nonfiction at Rice University, where she holds the Bruce and Elizabeth Dunleavy Chair in English, and she is the founding director of Rice's new MFA program in creative writing. She is also a former Inprint fellow. We are delighted that Lacey is with us tonight. And afterwards, George will meet folks and sign books in the right here in the back of the theater. That's where, well, no, I'm sorry, I'm confused. Brazos is going to stay right here in the back of the theater. We're going to go upstairs and have the book signing in the grand foyer, which is the nice big lobby area, and room for everybody. And Brazos will offer a 10% discount on signed copies of Vigil and online at brazosbookstore.com through Sunday. The discount code is Inprint. Well, just a tour of the titles of the story collections by MacArthur Fellow George Saunders makes me shiver with happiness. Civil War Land in Bad Decline, Pastoralia, In Persuasion Nation, Liberation Day, and the prize-winning 10th of December. Colson Whitehead calls his Booker Prize-winning novel, Lincoln in the Bardo, a luminous feat of generosity and humanism, and Zadie Smith calls it a masterpiece. George is also the author of the essay collection, The Brain Dead Megaphone, which Vanity Fair calls bitingly clever and compassionate, an Animal Farm-style parable called The Brief and Frightening Reign of Phil, and a children's book, a middle grade book, called The Very Persistent Gappers of Fripp, with artwork by Lane Smith, who illustrated the great picture book, The Stinky Cheese Man, which if you have kids of this vintage, you will know that book. His nonfiction book, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, in which 4 Russians give a masterclass on writing, reading, and life, is based on 20 years of teaching a class on the Russian short story to his MFA students at Syracuse University. Of course, George's 2013 commencement speech at Syracuse, titled in book form, Congratulations, by the way, became a New York Times bestseller by tapping into a desire in people to lead kinder, more fulfilling lives. And George has served, I'm proud to say, for many years as a member of the Inprint National Advisory Council. George's new novel, Vigil, explores the waning moments of the life of an oil tycoon in Texas named K.J. Boone and his encounter with what you might call his guiding spirit, Jill Dahl Blaine, whose task is to ferry Boone comfortably into the next life. The problem is Boone will not be consoled because he has nothing to regret. He lived a big, bold, epic life, and the world is better for it, isn't it? Vigil transports us through the wild, final hours of a complicated man. Hamilton Kane in the Boston Globe calls Vigil pure Saunders. The death of empathy, he insists, is greatly exaggerated. Pico Iyer in Airmail writes, part of what makes Saunders such a daring and inventive original is that he gives us zany, even cartoonish beings who inadvertently become messengers for something sneakily profound. I've never read anything like this before. If I'm lucky, I'll never forget it. Saunders, as Dave Eggers puts it, is a complete original. There's no one better, no one more essential to our national sense of self and sanity. Let's give a joyous, warm welcome back to Houston to George Saunders.
Thank you. Thank you, Rich, so much. This life goes by so fast, doesn't it? And I loved hearing Rich's history of my interaction here with Imprint. I'm sure you know it, but Imprint is really a national treasure. It's a model of what these kind of programs should be. So I'm so grateful to have been part of it all these years. And these days, I think one thing I'm finding out in all the mayhem is community. That's it. That's a salvation. And a beautiful series like this that's endured for so many years is a community maker. So thank you so much for your part in this and for having me back so often. So I'm just going to read. Years ago, I was in a car with this Polish driver in New York, and I was late, and he was very zen, didn't really care. And he said, "Sir, you go to do reading of your work?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "A little advice for you. Don't read too long." I was like, "Oh, you know my work." He said, No, the people, they don't like, just talk. So I'm going to follow his advice and just read a little bit of the opening of this book that Rich set up so beautifully. So here we're just in the voice of this woman, Jill Dahl Blaine, who we find out died in 1976 at the tender age of 22. And that's really all we need to know, I think. What a lovely home I found myself plummeting toward, acquiring as I fell arms, hands, legs, feet, all of which, as usual, became more substantial with each passing second. Below, a fountain. At the center of the fountain, a gold-plated statue of a dog. Someone must have really loved that dog. In the mouth of the golden dog, a golden duck. The duck's beak was hanging open in death, and a pocked area in its flank seemed meant to represent the entry field of the shot cluster. I observed all of this as I plummeted past, and then my head and torso pierced the asphalt crust of a semicircular drive and lodged in the dirt below. My rear was in the air, my fresh new legs bicycling energetically. I found myself alternately clothed and unclothed. That is to say, one instant naked and the next clothed. Or to be more precise, partly clothed. Over time, that is, the elements of my outfit grew more reliably visible. My beige skirt soon became a near constant. Meanwhile, here is a burrowing worm to consider, and a brown bottle shard, and the rich smell of the loam now completely encasing my inverted upper half. Once in Tennessee, having landed in the more conventional upright posture, I spent 6 hours in a paddock, my head protruding above the surface of the earth, being trotted through again and again by 3 black horses and 1 roan, who never during those hours ceased being panicked by my presence. And yet, I had a fine success on that occasion, my charge being greatly comforted. Tonight, blessedly, the thaw proceeded quickly, and I found myself able by sheer force of will to bolt up out of the ground gymnastically and stand upright, both fully and consistently clothed. Beige skirt, pale pink blouse, black pumps. The golden dog shone in the glare of an ornate carriage lamp. I made for the front door and, not yet walking competently, collapsed to the earth like a just unstrung puppet, then leapt to my feet and moved on relentlessly to my work. The door, immense, heavy, dead-bolted, presented no meaningful impediment. Passing through, I emerged into a magnificent entryway, then ascended a spacious stairwell lined with image after image of my charge, leaning confidently against a podium, speaking to a tremendous crowd, squatting with a keffiyeh-wearing fellow before the Great Pyramid of Giza, knee-deep in the shallows of some high mountain lake beside a young woman I took to be his daughter, driving, pretending to drive, a piece of heavy machinery, wearing a hard hat and a 3-piece suit, posing before an oil rig, and another, standing with his wife on the Great Wall of China, both beaming as if this represented a singular moment in their union. Arm in arm with her in what looked to be the rose garden of the White House, with her again before what I understood to be a second home in Colorado, and a third in Hawaii, a fourth in Key West. Often on his face the same look, more grimace than smile, albeit shot through with a measure of forced goodwill. Reaching the second floor, I moved along a hallway hung with numerous paintings in gilt frames, each marked by a plaque mentioning some experience our charge and his wife associated with his acquisition. Lovely cliffside dinner, Positano. Catacomb tour, Paris. Mr. Pavarotti sang beautifully for us after dinner. Guest of Senator Jeps and Maria in their fabulous desert home. At the end of the hall hung a double door of sturdy oak. A familiar tan purse now appearing over my shoulder, I patted it once, twice, as I would in the bygone days, when about to embark on a challenging task, then pass through, knowing that my charge must be found on the other side. And here he was, a tiny, crimped fellow in an immense mahogany bed. I was not too late, neither was I too early. His wife, exhausted by care, sat fully dressed on a love seat near the bed. Her slippers lay on the floor, turned in toward each other as if being worn by some invisible, pigeon-toed individual. But she was not my concern. My charge's sleeping clothes were of silk, his initials monogrammed above the heart. Moving closer, I entered the orb of his thoughts. Within him abided a formidable stubbornness. A steady flow of satisfaction, even triumph, coursed through him, regarding all he had managed to do, see, cause, and create, especially given his humble origins. I scanned for doubts regarding things he had done or left undone, things he might have said but had not, mistakes which he had not yet fully admitted, any of which might keep him from attaining that state of total peace so to be desired at this juncture, and found nothing, or nearly nothing. He was as sure of himself as ever a charge of mine had been, even now, as the terrible illness overtook him. I felt again the old, familiar, generalized fondness. Before me lay a person who had not willed himself into this world and was now being taken out of it by force. The many subsystems within him that had always given him so much satisfaction shutting down agonizingly. Soon it would come, accompanied by disbelief and panic, and he would find himself on the wrong side of a rapidly closing door. Everything he had ever known and loved out of reach, over there, beyond it. At such moments, I especially cherished my task. I could comfort. I could. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. Also, before we begin, I just want to, if it's okay, acknowledge Rich Levy, who I think many of us know is retiring, but just thank you, Rich, for all that you've done for literature and for Houston. Like, I know... Yeah. As you rightly pointed out, I was an Imprint fellow. I definitely would not be sitting here today if it were not for Imprint.
He's a national treasure, really.
He really is, truly, truly. So thank you so much for that reading of Vigil. So as Vigil follows KJ Boone, this oil CEO tycoon, who on his deathbed is visited by spirits, angels, some guiding spirits, and spirits from his past who show him the consequences of his actions, especially, I think, the environmental ones, and ask him to take responsibility for his life. Boone is trapped in a kind of delusion. I think we understand that he's done everything right, that he's been a huge success. Jill Dahl Blaine, who's one of the spirits, seems to believe that if only KJ Boone would acknowledge the harm that he caused, take ownership and responsibility for it, she will be able to fulfill her purpose, which is to comfort him. And in tension with this, we have the character known as the Frenchman, who seems to want revenge or punishment. He's much more sadistic in his approach, right? And so all of this is to say that there seems to be a question that you're working through in this book about the moral value of accountability. So I just wanted to start there and invite you to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I've been on the road with this book for about a month, and it's the way I work. I don't always know the meaning of a book when I get done with it. I know where it means, and I know kind of how to tune it, but I don't really understand it until I get out. I think this book, in a way, is kind of an export of my mental state around this question of what does one do confronted with evil. For me, the through line of the book is a stinker dies. That's the, you know. So I was kind of thinking of A Christmas Carol for sure, you know, a couple of Tolstoy stories, Master and Man, and of course The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and then a beautiful Catherine Ann Porter story, since we're in Texas, the Jilting of Granny Weatherall. So all these, and you know, as a person of a certain age, you do kind of start thinking, well, how did I do, you know? And if I can look back and see something I wish I had done better, what do you do with that, you know? So in this situation, Jill is kind of like the part of me that is I'm a pretty loving person. I like people. I have a lot of sympathy for them. But also has a touch of what we would call in Buddhism idiot compassion, where like somebody drives a spike through your head and you go, oh, thank you for the coat rack, you know, that kind of thing. But also I think she's fundamentally right, and we can talk about that. The Frenchman is a little more of someone who says, all right, if you really want to transform somebody, you first have to get them to admit that they did something wrong. So they kind of go back and forth, and as I'm talking about the book, I kind of see that neither one of them is that great at their job. So it's kind of, for me, I mean, not to flatter myself, but I kind of feel like it's a bit Gogolian, the whole thing. You know, this guy who is guilty of a lot, and he's kind of racing to the finish line. He's got two helpers who are inept, which is kind of the story of life. Yeah.
So, as you say, like Jill seems to want to let Boone off the hook because he is, in her words, an inevitable occurrence, right? I want to hear you talk a little bit about what that means. But first, you know, he couldn't have been any other way from the way he was, right? He was the product of his circumstances. And yet she also seems to believe in his capacity to change. And the Frenchman takes a harsher view, and there's much more urgency in his purpose, right? But also he bases that on a belief in Boone's capacity for change, though he seems much more judgmental that this change has not already occurred. So I want to hear you talk a little bit about how those two things are in tension with one another.
Yeah, I mean, again, this all kind of just came out, and I'm still kind of processing. But I think, okay, I had an experience when I was in first grade. I was a good reader, and I was in a Catholic school full of hot nuns. They were, at least they seemed that to me, you know, mysterious, you know, and they, I know you know what I'm talking about, so I loved school so much because I could read really well. I picked it up right away. The nuns just thought I was great, and every day was a carnival, you know. And this went on. And then there was one day when there's a good friend of mine from the neighborhood, and he was not a good reader. I think he was probably dyslexic, actually. So, you know, and the nuns were not so good to him. They were being rigorous, but they were also kind of beating the heck out of him, you know, just verbally. So I looked over one day, and this guy who had kind of, you know, played it pretty tough, he kind of deliberately turned away from the class, and he was crying a little bit, you know. So, and I just remember distinctly feeling very ashamed of how victorious I felt. I was taking a victory lap every day. And then I thought, well, why? What did I do to deserve this credit? I didn't in the womb check off the box saying, make me a good reader so the nuns will love me. I would have, but I didn't have the choice. And he didn't check off the box saying, you know, make my life difficult. So something in that is in Jill. And so at the moment of her death, she, for complicated reasons, switches consciousness with the person responsible for her death. And in that, she gets kind of a new window on self. So I've heard it described that self is like a sheet that you put over your head, and it's sheer. And so everything that you see in the world is, you think it's the world, but it's actually the self, you know. So for a second, she takes off her sheet and puts on someone else's, and gets a shocking picture of what the self actually is. And this kind of leads to this mercifulness. So one of the things she tries to do is she keeps trying to convey this rather complicated philosophical idea to this dying guy. And he's not having it because he liked that the nuns liked him, you know. So her thing is that she's had a beautiful experience at the end of her life and can't quite let go of it. The Frenchman, I think, is more like the relative person who says, in a way, he trusts K.J. Boone more and like, no, if I can get this guy to just look frankly at what he's done, because he's a massive denial, then maybe there's some chance, even at this 11th hour, that he could, fess up. There's a beautiful part in that Tolstoy story, Death by Vanillage, which Tolstoy supposedly thought it up because a neighbor of theirs had screamed for 3 straight days at the end of his life. So Tolstoy's like, oh, good stuff, you know.
Great material.
But so anyway, in the story, the guy who's dying, he's not a terrible guy, but he's been kind of conventional his whole life, and this has kept him from connecting with his loved ones. And there's a beautiful thing that Tolstoy does where first the guy says, absolutely not. I lived the right way. This is unfair. Why should I be dying young? A day goes by, and he thinks, all right, maybe I didn't live the right way. A torturous day goes by as he wrestles with that. Finally, he says, okay, wait. If I didn't live the right way, that implies there must be a right way, and I could know it. And at that point, he starts to get some real relief. So for me, K.J. Boone was, he's a figure of great denial, you know. And so for me, his redemption would be if he could just for 1 minute say, maybe I didn't live in the right way. And, you know, yeah, that's.
Yeah, you've said that you, in researching for this novel, you researched CEOs of oil companies, right? To just sort of see what was within the realm of the plausible, right? And one of the ideas that you seem to be navigating is is that we can potentially accumulate enough power or wealth to be above suffering. And yet he does seem to suffer from what I have heard you call the central delusions of the self. And you started to talk about it a little bit in how you're describing Jill. So will you walk us through what those delusions are?
Well, I mean, I'm a kind of a baby Buddhist. Like, I know a lot of real Buddhists. And one of our friends said, well, you're a fellow traveler. You know, you're not. No. But in those teachings, they basically say that, you know, we pop into the world and the movie begins. And we're the star of the movie. And we have this amazing supporting cast, you know, mom, dad, the milkman, everybody. And immediately the mind starts telling us this fiction that we're central to everything that's happening, that we're permanent, and also that we're separate from everything else, that we're in a special class. And so I think, I mean, as I felt my life, as I go into my 300th year, it seems kind of like the job is to get over that. Like, you're not separate, you're not permanent, you're not central. But so much of the way the mind works, it's just to reinforce that a little bit. So this guy, K.J. Boone, is kind of a person who's, I mean, everything's gone well for him. He belongs to a tribe of oil guys, as I did when I was younger. The world has opened up for him. So I think, as is the case maybe for all of us, when life is beautiful, thank goodness, you know, but also beware, because the world is then forming a casing around you to reinforce those 3 ideas, you know. So it can be very. Chekhov says every happy man should have an unhappy man in his closet with a hammer to remind him by his constant tappings that not everyone is happy. So I think that's part of his issue.
I want to stay with the self for a second. Why are these delusions of the self, that the self is central, separate, and permanent, why are these problematic?
Well, because at the end we get the memo that none of them were true, you know, and I think that's what at least for me, I mean, my fear of death is that I'm going to have to realize all those things suddenly, you know, and I think age prepares us for those things in some ways. You know, you go bald and you're like, oh, that's not supposed to happen in my movie, you know. But I think at least in Buddhist teachings, that suffering has to do with being not in relation to truth. So if you think, who can help it? I think my movie's going very well, you know. Of course you should feel that, but at some point the universe is saying, well, it's a pretty temporary movie, you know. And also, you've got an exaggerated view of how important it is. So I think I think all the spiritual traditions say be in relation to the truth, and then you won't suffer as much. And to the extent that we're letting the ego gas us up and so on, reinforcing the idea of our own centrality, then I think you're in for a fall at some point, you know.
And if we can, I guess, map some of those delusions back onto KJ Boone, I guess for him, we see some of the kind of cascading ramifications of these delusions too, that he thinks that he's central, that he's permanent, that, what's the other one? That he's separate, right? And that his actions, his success in his job, he's like refusing to let in these consequences, especially these environmental ones, and the ways that his actions and in particular the kind of so he advocates for a kind of view of climate, like a suspicion and casting doubt on climate change, right? And that ends up having all these extending consequences for all these other characters in the novel, right?
Yeah, he's kind of, I based him on this kind of, I mean, it's kind of quaint now, these circa 2000 villains who still believed in Enlightenment values. They still were embarrassed if you caught them lying. Wasn't that sweet? But they tended to have, you know, pretty high functioning family lives. And so, but if you look at there's a great book called The Merchants of Doubt, and it follows this group of PR people, and politicians and later some executives who took the same approach, that they used to deny that tobacco was dangerous and then transferred it to oil. So there was a moment in the late 90s when President Bush was when he was campaigning, where he was very open to climate change being real, was going to fix it. And then there was a weird little period of a few months when he took over where it all shifted. And the precedents for KJ Boone were the people who orchestrated that. And they gave us the rhetoric of denial, which now, you know, we've taken that and added a large dose of stupidity to it. And now, you know, but so he's a bad guy, but he's also, in some ways it's hard to, I think if you met him, you'd probably like him, you know. So it was interesting to use somebody like that as a test case for what forgiveness or redemption might look like.
Yeah, and I think also one of the things that he shows is that a consequence of this, you know, delusion of the self is that when you embrace that delusion wholeheartedly, it causes suffering, right? And it creates these failures of kindness. And we see that in macro ways with the environmental impacts of KJ Boone's delusion being evident in climate disasters and environmental suffering, but also in micro ways, micro ways, not waves. That's different. But in terms of how the delusions of the self make Jill sort of like wobble in her purpose a little bit, right? That she, I guess later in the novel, when she starts to kind of like think about her specificity as a human, then she loses her elevation, right? And she starts to wobble in her purpose a little bit.
Yeah, there was an I mean, this might be a little bit too inside baseball, but I wrote Lincoln and Bardo. I had a great time with that. And that format is kind of weird, but it's got a lot of hidden values that I found out. So I thought, I'll do that again. I'll use that same format. But I'll tell this story with it. So I worked for about 2 months, feeling pretty good about it, you know, as writers do for the first 2 months. And I had two ghosts. I had Jill, who's kind of a 1970s kind of working class person, speaks kind of in vernacular. And I had this guy who could have been airlifted over from the Lincoln book, kind of a 19th century, very high diction kind of guy. And so they were there, and it was okay, and they're floating around the bed and all that. And then one day I read it and I thought, I think this sucks. And of course, you know, as all writers know, there's a voice that goes, no, it doesn't. It was good yesterday, you idiot, you know. So I said, okay, so I read it the next day and I went, no, you know what? This is really slow. So it took about 4 days of you know, continued suckage to kind of go, all right. So I just decided to choose one. So I chose Jill because I kind of was in love with her already. She was so sweet. But I didn't want to lose the high diction. So I did this writerly thing, which is I just threw them into the same file. So now suddenly Jill is talking weird. You know, she's talking high and low, high and low. When I was a younger writer, I just would have fixed it, you know, choose. But as an older, ancient writer, I'm like, okay, that's good. You've made a real problem for yourself. And in a book, a problem is your best friend. It's like if you were Houdini and you said, I'm now going to escape from this light windbreaker. Go ahead. I'm going to go get a coffee. But if it's really, if he puts on chains and he jumps into the Hudson, then it's good. So for me at this stage, it's like if I get to something that seems impossible, that's really interesting. So I just said, okay, Jill, keep talking like that. And I'm going to figure out why, So at some point, it was very kind of sweet because I put a wedding next door. So this person who's very high-minded and angelic and always preaching about comfort and elevation, every so often she gets a little whiff of that wedding. She'll hear a song or smell some food, and it just kills her. She really doesn't want to be dead. Poor thing. She died at 22 traumatically. And as I was writing the book, I found myself thinking a lot about the people I lost in my 20s and how much life has happened since then. You couldn't imagine the amount of loss, And so she became the main character, and her defect in voice became like soul revealing. And the whole book, she's fighting to stay up in what she thinks is this exalted territory and not go down to her former self, which she so longs to do, Yeah.
And yet you've also said that Jill's perspective, which is that if you just acknowledge what you have done, or if you can just come closer to the truth, right, then all will be forgiven. Essentially, then I'll be able to comfort you. That it felt increasingly insufficient to you as you wrote the book and as the book went on. So I guess what changed for you as a writer in that realization?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm a big reviser. I love to revise. And the model I use is that if something offends you in your book, that's okay, but you have to acknowledge it and you have to respond to it. So she was talking to me about all this comfort, and I noticed that she wasn't actually doing much comforting, and so then you think, well, I need somebody to get in there and challenge her. So what you do is you write in the contrary voice, which in this case was that Frenchman. So this way of writing is kind of good because you don't have to, one, I would say you shouldn't know what you're trying to do. There's this idea in writing that, when I was younger, I had the idea that I was supposed to know a lot, and then you were supposed to sit there, and I was going to bring my big manure truck of ideas and drop it on you, and then you would admire me, which doesn't really add up, But then as I wrote more and more, I started to see it as basically really heightened intimate communication. So I'm over here working on my book, revising a lot. Why am I doing that? Because I want you to know that I respect you so much, dear reader. I want you to know that you're every bit as smart as me, and you're as worldly and kind and everything. So that actually becomes a kind of a revision tool, to make sure that in every line I'm showing respect. So in the same way, when Jill started seeming a little bit off to me, I could correct her, but actually she's manifesting character. So what I have to do is let the book come in and push back on her, in this case in the form of characters, but also to kind of know that the reader is feeling that about her. So in this way, I think revision is kind of an elaborate call and response mechanism. You do something for fun, and then you come back and read it, you see what you're doing, and then let yourself react to it.
Yeah, and I guess one of the consequences as a reader, I can report as being a reader of this book, is that one of the things I'm asked to consider is the value of forgiveness as a fundamental moral good, right? You're inviting me to question that here. And so I guess I'm wondering if there's something that lies beyond forgiveness, like truth, accountability, responsibility, that Vigil is asking us to consider more seriously in the realm of moral consequence.
And you've written beautifully about this in your first book, I know. You've written beautifully about this in your first book, this idea. One of the things I noticed about the book was he can't fix anything. I think in the book he has one line and he moves his hand once, and he's done this vast harm. So he can't fix it. So then it makes you think, what does redemption look like? And also it made me think, what would I do if if you can imagine a person you really don't like, some really reprehensible person, and then you think, okay, that person now is dying in front of you. They're sweating, they're in pain, they're terrified. What? And it's an interesting thought experiment because you can go up the chain of people you don't like. really high. What, I mean, you could spend an afternoon. It's a really good.
Right to the top,
yeah,
even.
Yeah. Bring a picnic lunch, yeah. But doing that, I mean, I don't have a real answer, but I think that, that's what the book is asking, really. And I've made him he's not the worst guy, but he's not great, So I think for me, there's a question of, is there anything he could do that would be a happy outcome for us? And my personal belief is I would like to see him take responsibility, and even if for a split second go, oh shit, I wish that for him. That would be beautiful in a way. On the other hand, if somebody is deluded like this and it's done a lot of harm and gets to the end and doesn't budge, that makes me really sad. It has no effect on the outside world, but somehow to me, the first thing is redemption. The second thing is sad. But again, you go up the chain of command and go, okay, Hitler. I don't know the answer to that. But Chekhov had this beautiful line about a work of art doesn't have to solve a problem, it has to formulate it correctly. So in his work, there's this beautiful thing where your everyday mind is trying to judge. I like this character, I don't like that one. And Chekhov will just outsmart you. And at the end, you turn to Anton. You're like, Anton, who should I like? And he goes, da. Yeah, like everybody, So that, I think, is a high-level fictional effect, if you can get it.
I like that we're on a first-name basis with Chekhov now, right? Anton. Yeah. Anton. What do we do?
He's from Brooklyn.
So I want to ask a little bit about process now, too. You talked a little bit about revision in terms of this book, but I would love to know, where this book began. What were the first seeds of this book? I
think it was those two ghosts farting around, just talking back and forth. And I'll do a lot of experimental stuff where you just really improv and just, and knowing that it's not going to stay, but it's just to get a feeling. So it was probably 4 or 5 pages of them kind of Abbott and Costello back and forth, And so my method is to be pretty loose with the early stuff. Just, it doesn't have to be good because you're going to rewrite it. So that gets me off of that potential obstruction of writer's block. Just write. And then that's all based on the idea that when I come back the next day and start reading it, I'll have some opinions. And I pretty playfully put them in, cut. So it's very, the first, months are very playful. And, I have a lot of faith that if a person can just get in the habit of accessing the finest elements of your taste, I like this, I don't like that, and put it into the work, then after many, many iterations, it's going to start to really feel like you. So that I'm a very anxious person, and when I was a young writer, it was all anxiety. Should I be funny or not? Faulkner or Hemingway? So finally, I didn't publish my first book till 38. And I was like, dude, you have to not be so anxious because you have to get some more books done. So a lot of my process is just, let's avoid the anxiety. And to have a high revision, like an active revision life means you don't have to ever be anxious. You just have to have faith that when you go in tomorrow, you'll have some taste. And that's it,
And you once described the process of writing Vigil in 6 words: freedom, stuck, breakthrough. So what were you stuck on during those long middle stretches, and what finally broke open?
I was stuck on the order. I had a bunch of scenes that I liked, and I knew they'd be in there, but I couldn't quite figure out which order they would want to appear in, and there was no real simple answer. So I did a Rubik's Cube of the whole book for about a year and a half, and then each time you'd move something, you'd have to refine that scene. And so it was really it's very OCD kind of writing. But I kind of know it when I get it. And so I have to be really I have one story that like a 25-page story that took 14 years. Yeah. Yeah. No, Clay, you should go, oh, you poor bastard.
And what's happening in that time? You're just Rubik's cubing it around?
Yeah, I'm gardening. No, I mean, mostly I work on more than one thing at once, but this one I'd come back to it again and again, and there would just be, this is a pattern I had where I'd just hit the juncture of a story, And I always talk about this meter, like you have positive and negative. So as you're rereading your work, you're trying to keep the needle in the positive zone, but very often it drops. And that's where you have to start revising. So in these stories, I would get to a certain point where I'm like, yeah, pretty good, good. And then, wow. And then you have to go, okay, this is not working. And then at that point, there's a complicated thing, which, when you're young, you just go, oh, I got to go to law school. I'm no. And then, but at this point, you just I always try to get in dialogue with the story, like, okay, so your needle just dropped into the negative. And the story will go, no, it didn't. Just keep going. That's okay. You can talk to me. What's wrong, little story? No, tell me. No, I'm boring. and then the key moment is to look at it and go, oh, you are boring. That's all right. It's all right. And then the trick is to sort of say, this is, I know, a little neurotic, but you say, could you be a little more specific? Let's not use that word boring. That's such a harsh word. And then the story will start to be a little more honest, and it won't use that voice anymore. That it'll say, well, look at page 8. All right. And look at that right there. Oh, the black cat jumped on the ebony the cat jumped on the ebony table. The dark hued expanse. And there's 4 phrases describing the black table. Oh, you're not boring. You're just repetitious a little bit. That can be fixed. So then you cut one out. So it's a kind of a dialogue that says there aren't really mistakes, but again, no denial. You have to be like KJ Boone. You have to say this story falls off the cliff at page 8, and we can work with it.
I like that in this dramatization that you have, this dialogue that you have with the story, which is with yourself, right? That one of the things you're asking the story to do is to be honest with you, right, about its problems, which I love this as a writer, identify with this deeply. But I guess I've noticed one of the things, like for a fiction writer, you talk and write and seem to think a lot about truth. Right. And I suspect that you are using that term differently from how I talk about truth in nonfiction, right? I'm a nonfiction writer, right? Also very concerned with truth. So talk me through a little bit about what truth means for you as a fiction writer.
First, you tell me. What does the truth mean for you?
Well, in nonfiction, as I talk with my students, we talk about truth in 4 different ways. There's veracity, which is whether or not something is factual. There's authenticity, which is whether something is real. Mimesis, which is whether it's a representation of reality. And candor, which is whether it's fully truthful, right? Whether it's telling the full truth.
Lucky students. Really, that's amazing. Yeah. For me, I think what it means is, do you, as a reader, rise to meet the thing I just said? Does it ring true to you? Does it speak to your lived experience in any way? So there's a beautiful part in a Tolstoy story where it's just a guy, he's just describing a peasant putting the harness on a horse. And I don't really know anything about that, but the things that he notes, the sound of the harness, it all feels real to me. And so really, for me, the barometer is, do I believe in this made-up narrative incrementally more than I did a second ago? So if someone says that, Hal walked across the field of freshly cut grass that July, and it smelled, as it always does, of kerosene, I'm like, no. Wait, go back, So, but if it's said correctly, even if you just omit the kerosene part, my senses rise to it. So it has something to do with making a shared space for the reader and the writer to step into the imagined world and agree that it's just, that thing just happened, So it's not only, it's a technique, really, because if I don't line up the moments of truth, you're not going to stay with me, what I'm calling truth. I often talk about, when I was a kid, I had this Hot Wheels set, and it was, it had these little pretend gas stations that had rubber wheels on the inside that would spin on a battery. So your car would go in there and get spit out and go around the track. And if you arrange it right, you could start it when you went to school and it would still be going when you came home, so it was a kind of cheap thrill. But that, I think a story can be like that. It's a number of those gas stations set up so that the reader, maybe she doesn't even know why, but she just keeps going. So it can be a joke, it can be a physical description, or it can be one of these moments of shared veracity, as you would say. Yeah.
And I'm thinking too, I taught this class a few years ago called Writers on Writing. And one of the things that I think writers struggle with is endings in every genre. Like, endings are really hard. And I showed them something that you had written about endings where, and this was based on a letter that someone had written to you, about resisting writing a happy ending, right? Because I think the letter writer felt like that was, I don't know, cheesy or too earnest or something like that. And the answer that you gave them had to do with, does it feel cheesy because it's not true, right? And I guess that's touching a little bit about what you say there, but I just want to invite you to...
Well, yes, but true in that context means true to what came before it. I think that's the main thing. So if when you get to the end of a story, you've said a lot of very specific things about the world, about the characters, and you've put the bowling pins up in the air. I think a happy ending is one that's honest to what came before. A sentimental ending is when suddenly the couple gets married, but they've hated each other the whole time. That's not a true ending, and it's a schmaltzy ending because it's forced. You wanted this ending, and it can also be. You can also have a sentimental dark ending, where you made an interesting problem and the writer, afraid of not being hip enough, just kills everybody or something, So I think that truth in that sense just means, have you made an organic thing that stays true to itself to the very end? For my money, that's by definition a happy ending. Like there's a beautiful story, that Jilting of Granny Weatherall, Catherine Porter, it's so terrifying, the ending. It's so sad. And it should, it inspires fear in anybody who reads it. But it's such a happy ending because it's perfect. She set you up perfectly, and she didn't flinch when she got there, I mean, in another context, and this is actually the most true thing about endings, an ending is just stopping without sucking. Really, yeah.
Right. But also, I just want to thank you for that, because I found it really useful in talking to my students who, as they're writing nonfiction, they want... and often writing about challenging, complicated histories, and they want at the end of an essay or a memoir or something to tie everything up into a neat little bow, but that ending isn't true. So I found it really useful. So thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit, I wonder if we might talk a little bit about Russians. Yes, let's talk about Russians.
Of course.
So you have this really wonderful book, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, in which 4 Russians give a master class on writing, reading, and life, which I really love this book. And it centers on the craft of the short story. And in it, you write that Russian short stories are constantly with you as you work, that they're the high bar against which you measure your own writing. So what is it about Russian short stories, Russian literature more broadly, that sets that bar so high for you?
I think, when I grew up in Chicago on the South Side, didn't know any writers, and we talked a little bit about those paths. And so I kind of had my early reading that meant anything to me. There was one really good experience with Johnny Tremain that a nun gave me, actually. And she gave it to me with...
The hot nuns?
Huh?
The hot nuns?
The hottest. Yeah, Sister Lynette, God bless her. No, I joke, that hot nun always gets a laugh, I don't know why. But she was a sweetheart. And she said these magic words to me. She said, I was in 3rd grade, said, "George, me and some of the other nuns have been talking about you in the convent." I'm like, you talk in the convent? But she saw that I was a good reader. So she had this copy of Johnny Tremain with the Caldecott medal facing out. And she said, some of the other sisters don't think you can handle this, but I think you can. So I was like, give me that book, So that was and Forbes is a great stylist. And it was the first time I ever had a language infest my brain, and I was doing it, mentally and imagining the world in those terms. But then I kind of stopped reading anything good. And so in high school, I was reading a lot of these kind of, I guess, quasi self-help books, Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and Khalil Gibran. And I just had the idea that books were to help you in some way. And they did help me, actually. So when I first came into the Russians, I felt, oh, okay, this is better. But it has the same heart, which is to say, dear reader, I see you. We worry about the same things. We're not that different. And I know that you're every bit as real as I am. Let's huddle here and see if we can figure this out before we leave, you know. So I always love that in the 19th century Russians, that they aren't going to waste your time with kind of, I don't know, like mere showing off. They really want to get to the heart of things. Yeah.
You say, this is a quote, "The Russians seem to regard fiction not as something decorative, but as a vital, moral, ethical tool. They changed you when you read them, made the world seem to be telling a different, more interesting story, a story in which you might play a meaningful part and which you had responsibilities." So I wonder whether you might say anything about the mechanisms by which these stories work. And I guess that's a question about how fiction can create change.
Well, I mean, I had a beautiful experience. I went to Syracuse for my master's degree, and our teacher there was Tobias Wolff, who was the great short story master in my view. And also Paul and I had we got engaged in 3 weeks in the romantic Syracuse ambiance. So it was a very heady time. I'd met my soulmate, and I was going to be a writer. And Toby was going to give a reading, but he had the flu. So he said, I don't feel up to reading my work, but let me read you Chekhov. So he read that Gooseberry, it's called the About Love trilogy. And that was a mind blower, because I had read Chekhov and I'm like, yeah, it's kind of slow. I don't know. I don't really get it, you know. And when he read it, it was like the best kind of stand up with a love letter. You know, it was just so beautiful. And in that room, you could just feel Chekhov beaming through Toby. And this thing I'm talking, like moral ethical, that's a little stodgy, but to have somebody feel so connected to you. And Toby would read it, and it's very funny, Chekhov, when you read it correctly. He would read it, and he would just wait. And the laugh would start. And he'd put the next line, and the laugh would build. And the next line, the laugh would build. And then the next line would just be so sad, you know. So there's something about that was so powerful. And it felt to me like if you ever want to talk about the moral qualities of fiction, it's not lessons. It's that, you know, someone who's been dead for 100 years seeing right into your soul, you know, and then having fun with it, you know, pulling a string, making you think about your childhood, make you think about your first love. I mean, that interaction between Chekhov through Toby to me was just like I mean, that's when I said, I'm doing this, you know, I'm going to be a story writer.
Yeah, and I think you still teach this Russian short story class and have for many years. Will you tell us a little bit about what that is? I
actually don't teach the class anymore. And the book came out of, I had done that tour for Lincoln and the Bardo, and my schedule changed. I got a better schedule, so I only teach a workshop. And I thought, oh, that means I'll never teach that Russian class again. And I was standing in class in that last session and you know, the chalk dust was in the air, and the students had just left, and we just had a beautiful moment. And I thought, oh man, you know, I taught that for 20 years, so you get all that student wisdom that gets put into you, and you carry it over to the next group and the next group. And I thought, man, if I don't do something with this, that just goes away, you know. So I had a red notebook of all the notes that I'd accumulated over the years. And I thought, I'll just type that up, you know. Of course, that's not it. I mean, all those years I'd been just asking questions, you know. Look at page 8. What do you think? And Syracuse, we get 700 applications, and we pick 6 people to come. So you ask a question like that, you get great answers. So then suddenly I had to answer my own questions. But such a beautiful experience, because I had so much wisdom from those students. And also I had their resistance. You know, certain stories they just hated. That was great, you know. And part of my job in the class was to say, okay, I understand you hate it. Let's talk about why, and what does that tell you about your aesthetic system? So it was rich, you know.
One of the nuggets from this book that I really love, and by the way, I love that I think all writing projects begin with I'll just blank. I'll just type up the notes in this red notebook. That's what I'll do. And then it becomes this.
This one will be easy.
Whatever. So in this, you say that what makes a piece of writing a story is that something happens within it that changes the character forever. I guess, how has that idea shaped the way that you think about narrative in your own writing?
Well, I think I have kind of a, in Chicago when I grew up, the joke was very high currency. If you could tell a joke, you were golden. And even better was we used to do a lot of voices. We'd do, like, you would imitate someone's mom. That was really funny,
To everyone but the mom.
Yeah, or the dad. You could do the dad. A teacher was very high on the, and then the highest form was when you would make up somebody, like, hey, I'm Todd Farquhar. And the friend would go, are you? Hey, Todd. And then if you were really good, you could, the whole day you could kind of do those voices, But the thing about Chicago and the joke aesthetic is you get to the end of a joke, and if no one laughs, you're in trouble, It's not good. So I think it was something about the way people told stories there. They put a lot of drama and a lot of emotion, and at the end, it had to do something, So I think my aesthetic has come out of that. Like a story should be joke-like in that it should be perfectly shaped to deliver the last line. All the waste should be cut out of it. Like if you have the joke about the duck who goes into a bar, you don't need a 15-page sidebar about what he's wearing. There's Linda Berry is a great cartoonist, but also a great writer, and she said that they've done studies of the brain when it finishes a short story, a short lyric poem, or a joke, and it does the same thing, which is it instantly goes back and instantly assesses for efficiency. And if it judges the thing has not been efficient, it reacts less powerfully. So that's kind of my story thing. Is that, it's got to be like a toy that you wind up and put on the floor, and it goes right under the couch as quickly as possible.
I appreciate that, but I also think that there's so much. Like your stories have so much moral stakes in them often that respectfully, I don't believe you about the wind-up duck going under the couch a little bit.
You're probably right.
That I think there's more to it, because you already told us tonight, right, that Chekhov famously said that a work of art doesn't have to solve a problem, only formulate it correctly. And so I guess I'll ask the question again a slightly different way, which is like, how do you know when a problem has been formulated correctly in a piece of your fiction?
The honest answer is by feeling. And it's kind of insubstantial, but it's in that rereading process. And so you're really trying to be kind of quiet-minded about it. Like I'm trying to imitate you if you hadn't read it before, or me if I hadn't read it a million times. So just coming to it like kind of, open. And then you're just seeing what happens. And at some point, it's kind of hard to explain, but if the jokes are gratuitous, or if the action somehow isn't the right action, it starts to slide downhill a bit. So the toy is circling in front of the couch, but also it's not meaning anything. So somehow it's very hard to talk about, but if I'm applying pressure and intelligence to the sentences, the consequences get to go up. You on the other end, you feel that as well. And one thing you might feel is that I already tried 9 things that didn't work, and the 10th is the most profound. Now I'm just tossing it out very offhandedly, but you're going to feel the labor, something like that. So it's very strange, and I do a lot of talking about writing, but the real thing is very inarticulable, actually. I had a story called Sea Oak that was one of those ones I got stuck right in the middle of it and stayed there for 5 years. And I knew it was the first 6 pages were good, and I couldn't get past it. Finally finished it in a rush, had an insight into how to do it that came from out in space. I just realized it. Finished it. The New Yorker bought it. There was great rejoicing in our house. And then we were editing it. And we got started late, and Bill Buford was the editor, and he was a great editor, very kind of soft-spoken, deliberate guy. And he had a bunch of changes at the last minute, big changes. And I did that thing which writers do, which I went fishing for a compliment. And, like, Bill, what do you like about this story? And he goes, well, I read a line, and I like it. enough to read the next. That was it. So that really is actually the truth. So all the meaning and all the stuff that we talk about, I think it comes from the person on this end taking a lot of care with the way that each line arrives. And in a funny way, it's all contained in that, you know. Yeah.
Thank you for telling me the truth. So back to Chekhov. So Chekhov has also said that art exists to prepare the soul for tenderness, which is one of my favorite things to think about art. Do you find that to be true in your own experience as a reader and as a writer?
I think yes, but we have to define tenderness a little bit robustly. You know, if you you think of Flannery O'Connor, that's a tough world that she makes. You know, and she doesn't spare anybody, and you kind of feel like I'm over here with Flannery and we're making fun of everybody. But then she's got that wonderful skill of going, you go over there. And then you go, oh, you're making fun of me as well. And she goes, and then she comes over with you. You know, it's really beautiful what she does. But it's tender. I mean, it's not, you know, it's like we probably all have a relative who's a little rough, you know, but underneath it, there's real love. I think that a story can be tender in that way. And it opens up, I would say, what I'm saying is tenderness is that feeling of, let's see. Okay, again, in Chekhov and Gooseberries, he's got this beautiful speech that I mentioned earlier, every happy man should have in him. And it's really kind of a beautiful story about the possible decadence of happiness. You know, that if we live in this world only interested in our own happiness, it's a mess. It's very selfish, and it's built on the unhappiness of other people. Very profound. You know, a guy tells us after with some friends at having a drink, and you're like, wow, I never thought of it that way. I'm going to live like that. Yes. But then if you read it carefully at the beginning of the story, the same guy is bathing in a pond, and he's just enraptured with the feelings. Oh, God, it's so lovely. And his friends have to haul him out because he's in there too long. So this is the same guy. Yeah, it's in there. The same guy, you know, so you turn to Chekhov and you say, is happiness good or not? And he goes, yeah, you know, or so that is that feeling of saying, I've just outlasted my usual judging mind, and I don't know what to think, and I'm okay. I'm not opining at the moment. I'm just open. That, I think, is the tenderness that quote refers to.
Do you think that's what you're inviting us to a little bit with KJ Boone?
I hope so, but maybe not just with him, but the whole ecosystem. You know, I think that when you get to the end of this book, you're kind of looking at me like, what the hell? You know, what am I supposed to think? And I think I look back and you go, I know, you know. And so that's, I mean, it's tenderness. It's also trust. Like, yeah, this world is hard, brother. You know, that kind of a feeling. And this book was new for me because, like, at the end of Lincoln, you know, Lincoln rides out of the graveyard and there's a man inhabiting him, and everybody kind of knows what that means. I knew, Lincoln knew, Havens knew, you knew. They're all on a hill looking in the same direction, and I like that. This one is a little more like you get to the end, and she's talking in this lofty way, and you're like, oh my goodness, you're in some trouble, you know. But a little bit more of that feeling of kind of upset or ambiguity, I guess. I don't know.
I'd also love to talk to you a little bit about teaching, right? If you don't mind, just indulge myself while I'm up here. So you spent many, many years teaching writing, right? So I guess I have a question about what you're noticing in students now that feels different, if anything, from earlier generations.
Well, I mean, in some ways, it's beautifully the same. You know, like I'm you know, now so much older than my students. They stay at the same age, and I get older.
They get younger.
Yeah, they get younger. That's right. I have toddlers now who are getting MFAs. But so there's always, I think, on both sides, a little anxiety. We don't know each other, and then we sit down with the first sets of line edits, and it's so beautiful. You know, like they are exactly where I was, which is desperately afraid they're not going to find a voice for themselves. You know, so then you help a little, and the thing I've learned most is to listen. I used to not be much of a listener. I was anxious about showing them that I knew something. And now there's a lot of just listening, you know, marking something up, having a pretty good idea of what I would like to say to them, but not saying it yet, letting them kind of ask at some point. So that part hasn't changed a bit. I think there's maybe, basically more anxiety because the culture gives even less of a shit about writing than it used to. And they feel that. And in the publishing world, it used to be that a writer would be nurtured for 4 or 5 books, 6, the Cormac McCarthy example. Now it's a little more feast and famine. Roxanne Gay did a beautiful talk about that at the National Book Awards. So I think the students feel that, and there's some pressure to make sure the first one is a big book and all that. AI is looming, which to me is like, AI, stay out of writing. We don't need you. This is, human beings do this. You go over there and make a spreadsheet, Or, have you seen that? There's a Chat GPT commercial. This is to me the essence of the thing. Very lavish commercial. And it is a brother. It's like, ChatGPT, I want to take my sister, who I love, on a road trip. Can you design me an itinerary? I'm like, dude, that is your job. You're supposed to make the itinerary. So this idea that we're going to give up these things that we do and that we infuse with ourselves as gifts of love, we're going to let AI do that, including novel writing. No thanks. You don't need it,
Do you feel like that? Yeah, thank you. Right.
Thank you. Or as AI would say, I love that for you.
Right. Not to mention that anything that AI produces that's like a novel has been produced through the stolen intellectual property of people who write novels. Yes. Right. Yeah. So,
amen.
AI needs writers to keep writing for it to exist. So I guess the question, like a follow-up question, is like, how do you see those pressures shaping people's work, or is part of your job as you see it to help them resist that pressure, or?
Yeah, a lot of it is just to acknowledge it and say, yeah, it's true. You're right about that. It's kind of beautiful because at some level, I think they don't care, as was the case with me, and I'm probably with you. You think it's going to be all right, and they're very, very involved in just that process of trying to find out what they do. There's also, it's funny, over the last maybe 15 years, I noticed that I used to give a talk about, let's make sure that you're writing about something that matters. There was a lot of kind of, I would call it lifestyle fiction, like, I did a lot of drugs by the river. And I did a lot of drugs at my friend's Bob's house, and we were so wasted. And, but I don't see that anymore. I think the students that I have now are quite beautifully empathetic and full of the right sort of questions. And so there isn't much of that at all. It's kind of their hearts are in the right place, and they're really trying to.
Well, I guess I have not been teaching quite as long as you, but for a long time. And one of the things I've noticed is like an embrace of earnestness that maybe even before COVID was, people were more cynical. They were more inclined to satire. They're more willing to sort of say something different from what they really meant. And now they're much more willing to say what they really mean and to be earnest. Are you seeing that?
Is that a strength as you see it in that work, or?
I really like it. I'm glad to see it. Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, I think now that you say that, I think that's actually true. And it's funny to see, to compare myself at that stage with them and go, wow, you're really people, So I think that's really great. It's a good thing.
I guess I'm realizing, I didn't intend this, but I'm realizing that, like, I see in your work also a turn towards earnestness. The sort of earlier work is more satirical, more biting, and definitely I see it with like Lincoln and the Bardo, like an embrace of earnestness. I guess, how do you see yourself evolving toward that?
You've really put your finger on the main thing for me, which is I love that early work, and it's very much alive in me, and I could do it. I also love Lincoln and the Bardo, and it's alive for me, and I could do it. So there's something, whenever I talk to somebody who has a binary in writing, like, should I be funny or serious? The answer is always neither. There's a third path where you combine them. So that's what I'm really kind of trying to figure out for this next book is, is that a false binary? Earnestness versus cynical, or earnestness versus biting. I'm going to assume that it is, and try to find the middle path between those two, because I think there's a lot in our culture. There's a lot of value in saying that things are quite unfair, quite sometimes nightmarish for certain people. And on the other hand, I look at my life and I've been so blessed. So both those things have to be true. And that's a question that's very much alive in my mind for sure.
I guess a follow-up to that is, what does, at this point in your career, what does evolving as a writer mean to you?
Well, I mean, it's kind of saying, have you done the thing you should do? Do you want to? And the answer is no way. What is it? Well, it's something, it's just something so beautiful, For me, it has something to do with reconciling this idea of good and evil, or maybe bemoaning life versus celebrating it. It's some mix like that. So I published my first book at 38, so I feel like I'm really racing to get something done. But I also know that for me, the most dangerous thing would be to decide what kind of book I want to write, because then I might write that one, But to say, I'm like, right now I have nothing except one story. So I love that I'm going to go home, recover from this touring, and kind of go, okay, what's rich? And for me, the key is always language. What language do I have back here that's going to come alive? And I'm kind of saying to myself, go ahead, like be cynical and earnest. Do both, yeah. Or a cookbook. that could be
Is that
saucy and sweet, something like that? I don't know.
Is that tied together in any way with evolving as a person?
Yes. We did, Paul and I had a beautiful period of about 7 years where we lived in upstate New York, and we were meditating with a group 2 to 4 hours a night, every night. And and that's a lot of meditation. And what happened for me was, in a tiny way, I started to go, oh, you're sarcastic. Or like I noticed if I go into a social situation back then, I would always start trying to find the loose thread, and I thought, that's me, right? And during this meditation, like, no, it isn't you. That's just a habit. And that's when Lincoln got written, because I could kind of go, oh, there's positive phenomenon here. Let me let it in. So it's something, there has been a personal development in that way. Although meditation, I used to meditate in the morning before I wrote, and that was a problem because I'd feel so groovy, and then go to read and go, that's perfect, great. So I had to push the meditation later in the day. But I think, personal development, for sure, that for me, the best way to develop is to try to write something and see, because your own, all your stuff comes out, and then you can either correct it or you can work around it, but you can't not see it, I guess, yeah.
So I'm coming to the end of my questions here. We're coming to the end of our time, but I've read a lot of your writing, a lot of your interviews, just in preparation for this conversation. And it seems as though one of your philosophies of fiction writing is that you let the fiction teach you and maybe even change you. So what did Vigil teach you?
I think it externalized something that's urgent to me, which is this question of, kindness, compassion, empathy. What do they actually look like on their feet? And I think in this time, it's so urgent, to say, okay, I'm a pretty naturally friendly guy. I like people. I can get along. But that's clearly not enough right now, because people who are very enamored of power and power alone, who seem to have decided that cruelty actually isn't a bad thing, they're starting to run the show, So in my mind, it's like, okay, so how could I maintain my own values of kindness and love and all that and push back? That to me is the biggest thing. And I took a lot of inspiration from Minneapolis, because what did they do? What they did was they were ferociously peaceful. and they had community. And so I'm learning a lot from that, and I'm trying to let my work teach that to me as well. And the book is, I can see now, on the one hand, sort of enthusiastic, relentless compassion, but it's a little sloppy, as it is in me, actually, you know. So now, and then this Frenchman comes in and says, that's not going to cut it. And so in that way, the book is kind of working on me, you know. I have a South Side of Chicago thing. I used to get in a lot of fights as a kid, and that was just, the macho thing was just big. Suppressed that energetically. And now, there's kind of a drift where you're like, if I'm just always nice, am I a good person? No, actually, you know. So this idea, like if you went into a coffee shop and the barista was crying, what does kindness look like? I don't know, actually. It could just be being quiet and walking out of there. It could be saying just the right thing. So these are things that are really alive for me. I want to be compassionate and kind, but I don't want to be a pushover, basically, you know. That's hard.
Yeah. I think that's a really beautiful lesson for us all to take with us tonight. So thank you so much for this conversation,
Thank you
George.
so much.
Yeah.
Wonderful.